All right, Wander fam, welcome back to another episode of our show. Today we have Petr Mitev, who is the Vice President of Product at Enscape, a software product that empowers architects and designers to create real-time renderings and virtual reality experiences. And what's exciting about today's guest is that he comes from an architecture and traditional design background. And he's worked with the research group at Kieran Timberlake and has experience as the head of application development and design computation at NBBJ, which allowed him to merge his background in formal architectural design with his passion for empowering technology. Peter's main focus now, and what we'll dive into for our discussion today, is how he's leveraging product experience and knowledge of architecture industry to create solutions that effectively improve the environment around us and answer the most pressing questions we face today as builders of tomorrow. So, Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. And before we get started, is there anything right off the bat that you want the audience to know about you?
I think you said it all. Very strange background to find my way into kind of a product leadership role, product management in general. But excited to be here, and I honestly think it's had a really positive impact, although it's been a very indirect and winding road to get here. But I think it's really great that the company allowed me to take on this role, and it has a very positive impact on the product and the community that it serves.
Awesome. Well, we're super excited to dive right in. So, as always, we'll start off with our 1 minute rapid fire round of questions so that the audience can get to know you in a nutshell. So, are you ready, Peter?
I'm so ready.
Awesome. So, where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Bulgaria for about 8, 9 years, and then I moved to the States, and I've been living there for most of my life, and then well, recently moved here to Germany, but I'd say Bulgaria and the U.S. is where I did most of my quote unquote growing up.
Wow, quite international. So, you're now in Germany. Whereabouts?
So I'm in southwestern Germany, a small town called Karlsruhe. This is actually where our headquarters is located for the global company, but they call it the Miami of Germany. I think it's quite warm. That's about the only parallel I could find with Miami, but very different otherwise.
All right, Miami of Germany. And what's a book that you think everyone should read?
I really enjoyed. It's called Creative Selection. It's basically about the early days of product development at Apple, which is for me was a really fantastic perspective. Just to kind of, I mean, everybody knows that the company has been successful, right, and still continues to be successful. But the way that they got there and the way that they did iteration specifically on products on software, for me was really eye opening as just as a process of how to do it.
Creative solution. Awesome. We'll probably dive right into that a little bit into our conversation. Um, what is one app that you cannot live without?
Ooh, one app that I cannot live without. Well, since I am so international and I travel all the time, honestly, I mostly live out of a hotel. I think Google Maps or Apple Maps, I switch between the two, but just being able to know what's around me, especially in an unfamiliar place, for me has been really helpful.
You're one of those rare ones that are switching between the two. Usually, you find people are adamant about one or the other.
Yeah, well, that's the thing with traveling so much. I think I realized that one app is good in some countries and another app is a bit better in some others. So that's why I switched.
I see. Spoken like a true nomad. And what do you think is the best invention of all time?
The best invention of all time. Okay, well, I don't know if this is going to show my age here or not, but I would say maybe the internet,
The
just
internet.
in the way that
Yeah.
it has the power to connect people and yeah, basically democratize information, knowledge, entertainment, anything really. It's been crazy to see it develop into what it is today, but it's been a positive kind of crazy, I think, for the most part.
Yeah, of course. And what's your all-time favorite personal accomplishment?
All-time favorite personal accomplishment. That's a tough one. I'd say this is probably for my time at NBBJ, which is it's an international architecture firm, but being able to convince the not just the leadership there, but the clients that technology has the ability to make a profound impact on architecture and building design, and just the built environment around us. Because architecture is traditionally a kind of a field of work that's, well, historically been a little bit resistant to innovation, to scientific or technological advancement. So, the fact that we were able to create and build up a team and make as big of an impact as we did on projects like, Amazon headquarters in Seattle was, yeah, great thing to see take shape.
Wow. Okay. We definitely want to dive into that in a bit because our last question of the rapid fire round, I want to ask you, what's the biggest challenge you're working on right now?
Ooh, the biggest challenge we're working on right now. Well, in February of this year, we merged with a another company that focuses on a different part of visualization. They focus a bit more on the higher end visualization. They do things like Marvel movies, Star Wars, Hollywood type things, where we're kind of more on the accessible side. So it's been really exciting, the opportunity that we have to build something together that really doesn't exist. But it's also not easy, and I mean that's typically how it goes, right? The things that are worth doing are not the easiest things, but yeah, it's been a big challenge, and we've made a lot of progress, but there's a really long road to go. I think you could probably say that anytime two companies come together.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good segue into our interview. I'd love for you to dive in a little bit more about your experience merging with this company. Like, what was that like? What was the process? And I'm sure you've then taken on new team members too, right? So tell us about that experience.
Yeah, it's been, I think, well, like I said, very, very interesting that we even had the opportunity in the first place. And what was exciting is that it was one of those rare times where I think to everybody involved, the merge made complete and total sense. I think in a lot of cases, there's always a little bit of overlap or even conflict between two products, two companies. And in our case, it was completely complementary. We were serving kind of very different use cases, very different user groups, so in that sense, it made a ton of sense, right? But that doesn't mean that it was completely without friction, right? I mean, I think every corner of the organization kind of had to be very flexible and ready to adapt to new roles, to new functions, to new structures. Because for us as a 100 or 120 person company, what made sense doesn't necessarily always translate to where we are now, which is about a 800 people company since we've taken on some other acquisitions in the meantime. And it's kind of forced us to really focus in on what goals we want to pursue and accomplish, and really kind of even redefine what success means for us now that we're a much larger entity and we have a much uh, bigger dream, I guess, and bigger set of goals that we can kind of only achieve together. So, challenges not just on that side, the business side, but also, of course, on the personal side, right? Because at the end of the day, the people, well, the things that make a business great and successful are the people, and they're the most valuable resource, right? But people have feelings. They're not a spreadsheet. They're not a product. So it's definitely been challenging to react to some of those feelings that people have, and to kind of mitigate them successfully, while of course making sure that everybody's got the best kind of environment that they feel supported, and an environment that they feel like they can grow and succeed in. So yeah, lots of challenges on the personal front, I'd say.
Of course, yeah. Anytime there's a new change, there's going to be people who we need to be flexible with, and especially as they're going into new roles and functions, as you mentioned. So, as a product leader, how do you? Two questions that are coming out of that. Like, one, how did that impact the work that you were doing now that you have these other roles and new team members that are coming in? It kind of changes the vision a little bit, right? Even though you mentioned that it's complementary products. So that's one. And then two, just going on the people side, how do you ensure that everyone is still staying focused on the greater vision uh, and having everyone kind of unison?
Yeah, yeah. I think the first part, in terms of how it changed kind of the day to day. I mean, the perhaps the more obvious side of it is that a lot more people are involved and informed. The teams get bigger, the stakeholders get more, and you kind of have to be very careful about making sure that everybody feels heard, and that you then kind of collate all those different voices into one cohesive well, strategy for success. And I mean, there's really no shortcut to doing that. I think being very personal with everybody involved is really key, because what works for one person in terms of a communication or management style doesn't necessarily work for somebody else. And I think a lot of times it's easier for small companies to get that right, just because you have a smaller, amount of people that you need to kind of communicate differently to. But in a larger company, I think it's still very, very important, because if you kind of lose sight of the importance of that individuality and the fact that everybody responds to different kinds of motivation or communication, you really run the risk of losing some key people. And once you start losing people because of something like that, then kind of inherently the soul of the company changes, and that has an impact on the products, right? So the people and the things that made them successful before, you may not be able to rely on them in the future. So really, for us, it was really important for everybody to kind of, yeah, be in constant communication and respond differently to different people, because they need different things.
Yeah, and that's one of the big organizational challenges, right? It's like when you're growing a company, you want to make sure that you're still getting everybody involved, everyone's input. But at what point do you say, okay, that's enough input. Now we need to just get the organization focused. I'm always curious, like where's the right balance between getting everyone's input and just taking the lead and saying, okay, this is where we're gonna head forward. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's difficult to draw the line. I think a lot of times it comes down to really kind of, even before you start, is making sure that you have clear goals for something, and because if you don't have clear goals, if the goal is just to, get better or grow or something like that, it's hard to say when you've had enough input and it's time to actually make a decision. But if your goals are more specific, saying we want to, I don't know, reach a new type of user, or we want to improve accessibility to feature X or Y, I think it's a lot easier to kind of realize when you've hit a critical mass of input or data points. Which, I mean, in terms of a product role, product management, or any other role, I mean, there's a lot of data coming in, right? If you're doing it right, you're getting a lot of data from users, from stakeholders, etc. But if your goals are clear, and if you kind of time box your efforts, it's a little more easier to be judicial and to say, okay, well, uh, enough is enough, and now we kind of have enough information to take a path forward.
Yeah, I really like what you just mentioned, which is time boxing. I think that's such a key aspect of decision making, right? Because you can get people involved, you can have all this information, but at some point you gotta say, okay, that's good. Let's move forward. And the other thing I wanted to highlight too, you said this earlier, was getting people involved instead of informed. I love that you mentioned that because I think that's super important, just to make sure that everyone has a say in the organization and that they're building this vision together. I wanted to ask, so what advice would you give to product leaders that are going through a merger of their own, a merger or an acquisition, when it comes specifically to products? Because there can be two similar products that they have to merge, and then there's a lot of technical gaps. You mentioned that the recent acquisition is a little bit more complementary, but I'm just curious, like for product leaders that are going through what you guys have gone through, if you had any advice on that.
Yeah, I think now that we've been at it for about 8 or so months, we've definitely learned a lot of lessons, and some assumptions have proven correct, some haven't. I think the biggest piece of advice that I can give is definitely be open-minded, and learn as much as you can about the other side. And I'm here kind of assuming a more simple, two-sided merger, not a three or four pronged thing. But I think the same advice goes, which is try to learn as much as possible and be open-minded, and just keep in mind that the kind of the feelings that you might have of uncertainty or maybe even fear, they exist on the other side of the fence too. And what I've seen sometimes in some of our teams is that people have a tendency to get a little bit competitive, or even tribalistic, almost like our success is our success, their success is their success. But you really have to completely get rid of that mindset, and any kind of idea of ego, it has to go out the door, and
Mm.
everybody has to start thinking about success as a collective thing and not an individual thing. I mean, everybody's going to have some pride, of course, still in their product and their brand and everything they've achieved to date. But it's also very important to recognize that going forward, after a merger, you are one entity. Success should mean the same thing for us and them. And honestly, the words us and them should really go out the door as soon as possible. But yeah, being open minded and learning about the products and the people you don't know are super critical to making it go as smooth as possible.
Yeah, I think you brought up such a great point, which is that I think a lot of times, especially as the company gets larger, you have so much ego in organizations. And, one thing I want to highlight is that as a leader, it's so important to get people to tie their emotions and whatever ego they have towards the success of the company, of the bigger organization, and not so much in a single decision or what's happening in silo. And I think we get so lost in that because there's so much ownership in the smaller units that they often forget that these smaller units are part of a bigger picture.
No, absolutely. I mean, even as you look at product roles, we even have, we have product managers, but we even have roles called product owner, right? So that idea of ownership is kind of always, to some degree, inherently tied to the people working in those roles. And the important thing to remember, I think, is that, yeah, you might be responsible for one piece, but it's one piece of a much bigger whole, and recognizing and embracing that bigger whole, I think, is really important, and it's much easier said than done. It takes time. There's no shortcut, but it's just something that has to be respected, I think, and embraced.
Exactly, exactly. And so let's dive into that a little bit more. Like, how can people have ownership in what they do without their egos getting in the way?
That's a difficult question. Yeah, I think once again, I think it goes back to setting the right goals and setting goals at different levels, right? Because especially in a large organization, a large product, there might be subcomponents of the product or the platform, whatever it might be. So you kind of have to set goals for success or targets for success for those individual components, but you also have to make sure that they really relate to a bigger whole. And that's something that we've kind of been definitely challenged with. We've been using a system called
Mm,
OKRs, objectives and key results. Some people use KPIs. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you call it or what system you use. I think what matters though is that the different hierarchies of those performance indicators or those goals, they have to relate to one another. You can't have the bottom level where a product owner might be working. You can't have it be completely disconnected from the higher level where a
mm.
C-suite or a vice president might be looking at. They have to have a connection, and everybody in the organization has to have an understanding of how their contribution impacts the success at all levels. And it really has to resound with everybody. And I think everybody has to feel like they're a part of that success. It can't be that a part of marketing or sales or even product feels like they cannot affect the success of the goals at the highest level. It has to really be connected as possible.
Gotcha. And how do you communicate that? And because I think you guys are remote, right? So there's a added layer of challenge in communication as a remote team anyway. So I'm just curious, how do you communicate these visions and goals if there's a specific way that you approach it?
Yeah, I think, well, honestly, I think it even starts earlier than that. I think it's the planning itself has to be as collaborative as possible. And we are, yes, in a unique position where, we have offices all over the world, but we also have a lot of people that are working remotely. So I think even at the planning stage, we kind of do what we say, double-sided approach. So there's the kind of the top down where, you start with business objectives. Um, but you also have a bottom up where basically employees at every level can inform the goals or the tasks that we have to achieve for the next year or two or three. So even at the planning level, everybody is involved, and it's kind of up to individual I think leaders, managers, to make sure that everybody's a part of that process again, that their voices are heard. But as that process continues, basically, every corner of the organization should be on the same page. They should know, of course, the timeline for getting that process done, but they should also know when and how they can contribute. So basically, what that leads to is that when you end up having to communicate it, it shouldn't be anybody's first time hearing this or kind of being surprised by it. Everybody should kind of say, like, okay, I remember when we were formulating this and I was a part of that, but maybe I wasn't a part of this, but I kind of see where it's coming together. And for me, that's kind of a really critical precursor to that successful communication. But I think for the communication itself, a couple of things that we've done to make sure that everybody's on the same page is, we are remote, but we try to find ways to get everybody together. It's not always possible. It's not something you can do every month or every week. But for something like the kickoff of the next, fiscal year, where these goals are being shared and revealed, we try to get as many people as we can in one place. And being global, that's not always possible one place, but we could definitely get a lot of people together in, let's say, New York, a lot of people in Germany, and maybe a lot of people in Sofia. And sure, some people might be online, but we try to coordinate and curate an event that really involves everybody at the same time. And maybe we have something like a get together or a bit of a party afterwards, so that everybody, it ends on a positive note, right? It's inspiring, and then everybody can kind of get together and just see some people that they may have not been able to see for a very long time. But yeah, I think that's actually worked out quite well.
Yeah, I think those are actually so much fun because we do that at WandrFul as well, working as a remote team. So I'm sure you can relate, like when you see your coworkers that you haven't seen in a while, or if you're meeting them for the first time after working remotely with them, it's almost like there's this feeling of like, at least for me, it feels like an old friend you haven't seen in a while. But I find these to be really helpful. Just one for culture building, and two, as we were talking about communication and just getting everybody on the same page. So I'm curious, just diving into this remote work, like what's some of the biggest differences you've seen in like how people approach innovation amongst the different teams? Because you said you have a team in Sofia, you've got a team in New York, you're out in Germany. So is it different the way that people approach innovation based on their cultural diversity?
Yeah, it's definitely different. And I think, once again, it's one of those areas where you have to, I think, before you get into it, you have to recognize it, that it is going to be a factor. And then you also have to take the time to respect it and respond to it. I'll give kind of a very, very easy and tangible example here for us, since I'm on both sides of the fence. Um, Myself, like I said, I was born in Bulgaria, so that culture is kind of, it's never going to leave me. But I've spent a lot of time in the U.S. and Germany, so I can kind of see the other side of the fence. Well, one interesting thing is, us Bulgarians, we don't always plan very much. We kind of just go with it. Okay, and that's completely opposite from what our German colleagues expect. They want a plan, they want a schedule, they want rigor and a system, right? And they want to know from A to Z how we get to that shared vision of success. So right off the bat, I mean, for us, that was a very interesting clash that we had to reconcile. And you had a lot of people that weren't aware of that difference. They thought, well, oh, the other side isn't trying to help me. It's not that they're not trying to help. It's just that their way of helping is very, very different, right? And once again, there's no shortcut to overcoming that. It really takes those people spending more and more time together, whether in person or virtually, and just being honest and open about their expectations, right? We even did a workshop shortly after our merger, where it kind of forced us to write some of these things and to uh, measure ourselves on certain scales, like how much we value punctuality, how much we value other kinds of aspects of collaboration. And just that exercise of having an American or German colleague look at the ratings that a Bulgarian colleague put together for themselves was really eye-opening for a lot of people. And a lot of people just looked at the other person's paper and said, I had no idea that you cared so much about the schedule being followed. I had no idea you cared about X, Y, and Z. And it was eye-opening, and people got a lot
Mm.
more empathy right out of the box. And I think it's something that we can see today. People are starting to build that flexibility that comes from understanding and respecting the fact that you're dealing with somebody that comes from a different background and has a different set of criteria that they evaluate collaboration through.
I love that. I think that's such an eye-opening exercise because it's a big cultural difference, but you just kind of think, oh, we're all here to work and we're probably going to work the same way, and then you don't realize that
Yeah.
that the cultural difference comes into the way sometimes. So I love that you guys went through that. I'm definitely going to use that at my company because we have a lot of different people from around the world too. And it's so funny that like I had no idea that like Bulgarians are more like go with the flow. I can only imagine like what kind of clash you guys have with the German company. What is there like any other like differences that you've seen, especially through the merger? I'm curious, like what other if there's horror stories or anything like that that you'd love to that you can share with us.
Well, luckily, no horror stories. But I mean, I think differences are coming out every day. And like I said, we're a global company with a lot of remote employees. So once again, I'll put myself on the spot here. When we first started working officially together, I had to get a bit of a crash course in working with the employees in our Japanese office because it's great. Yeah, like I said, I was on both sides of the fence: U.S., Germany, Bulgaria. But working with the Japanese employees and the culture that they're working in every day was completely new to me, and it took me a lot of time to start understanding their different expectations, the way that they work, and the things that they prioritize. Because for me to effectively make product decisions or business decisions um, that are positive for their clients, I have to understand their clients. I have to understand them and the culture that they're coming from, which is very different. And once again, it takes time. It doesn't mean that we can't collaborate on a shared outcome, but it kind of forces, I think, both sides to make some compromises, of course. And there's also,
Mhm.
of course, the physical realities of the world we inhabit, things like time difference, very challenging, right? For somebody that's in LA or New York to engage with the Japanese office, it can be tough, right? And there's a lot of aspects that don't make it any easier. But once again, getting together in person and virtually at every opportunity, I think, has really helped us. And of course, there's always room to grow. There's always room to improve, and the important thing is that everybody keeps an open mind, I think, and that continues to strive for that improvement and understanding, rather than doing these kinds of siloed or tribalistic things that there's always a risk of in a merge.
Yeah, wow. I didn't even realize you guys had a team out in Japan either. That literally sounds like you're gonna be up all hours of the day working with a different team. Like, when do you have time for a break and sleep?
It's hard to find. It's hard to find. But I mean, for me personally, I was luckily had that experience at NBBJ. We also had, teams in China, teams in Seattle and in New York. So for me, it was a little bit easier than for a lot of people. But for a lot of our employees, it was the first time that they were exposed to something like that. The fact that your inbox doesn't stop filling up just because it's 8, 9 p.m. Your chat messages don't stop. And I think for a lot of people, it was challenging because all of a sudden they had to, create a new kind of system or rigor for themselves in the way that they engage with their professional lives. And one thing that we saw with Corona, right, with the trend of everybody going more and more remote, positive in a lot of ways, but challenging in a lot of other ways for that same reason, which is that you might constantly be getting messages, you might constantly be getting pinged on XYZ. Doesn't mean that you have to respond as soon as it comes in, but for a lot of people, that's of course the natural reaction. So, it takes time for people to kind of decide for themselves how and when they engage with that kind of international flow of work.
Yeah, it's like having a international or remote work, or I guess just in general workspace boundaries, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm curious if you had any advice to product leaders that do work with international teams. Like, what are some of the things that you do to make sure that you're keeping focus, keeping sane? Because working remotely and having international teams is tough. Like we just talked about having working with different time zones, working across different cultures. So yeah, what would you say are some of your top advices on that?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it for me, it starts with going back to that point of recognizing individualism because everybody likes to work differently, right? And again, I'll kind of expose myself here. I'm completely fine to work for the most part on a 24-hour cycle. But just because I'm fine with it doesn't mean that I can expect my people to do the same. For me as a leader, it's important to kind of first instill the value in everybody that individualism is fine. And as a starting point, you kind of have to be honest with yourself and your not just your work situation, but your personal situation, your family situation. You know, what are the constraints in your life? What is important to you, right? Like some people have kids, some people have they go to school in addition to working a job, right? So it starts with, I think, identifying those things, identifying your priorities, and then based on those constraints, kind of setting a plan for yourself that makes sure that you are obviously dedicating enough time to your personal life, but are also spending the necessary amount of time in the business world to make sure that everything is going smoothly. And I think for everybody, it looks a little bit differently, and in some ways, that is kind of actually a benefit of the remote world because everybody can kind of be flexible with their schedules, and for the most part there's always going to be somebody working somewhere in the world for our company, right? So because your schedule is slightly different, it doesn't mean that you're alone and isolated. It means that the people that you might be interacting with just might be in a different part of the world just because they're awake at that time or active during that time. Um, so it's about setting those boundaries and yeah, making sure that everybody kind of is okay with being somewhat individual. Because if you kind of try to set hardcore rules for a large group of people, I think you run a big risk of yeah, just putting a lot of people off because they can't really meet those expectations. And let's face it, they maybe don't even need to because we're a large team. Everybody should be able to find enough support if they're looking for it, and it's important to recognize those individual differences.
Yeah, so you're not getting everyone to be working 24/7, right? Like you are?
No, no.
No. I don't know how you're able to, because you mentioned you're like, oh, I'm okay running on a 24-hour work schedule. I'm like, what? You're crazy. No, I can relate to that. Um, but going back to the boundary part, I think what you touched upon is super important, which is like, what are your priorities, right? And I talk about this with my team too. I think how you take accountability in your personal life permeates into how you take accountability in your work life, right? So, in your personal life, what are some of the things that are really important to you? And especially working remotely, like build around that, right? So, if family is important and you have to pick up kids, then build your work schedule around that. If you're if you have to get up early and you want to like ease into your day, then build your schedule around that as well. So I think having for as organizations, like having flexibility for your people to allow them to do that, I think is super important, especially as we're becoming more global and more remote in the work settings. Okay, so let's jump into our third segment of the interview because I want to touch upon your background and how you got here. I think it's super interesting because you have a traditional design and architectural background. So, how did you get here? Like, what intrigued you to jump over to the tech side?
Yeah, good question. So, yeah, I did. I mean, I studied architecture for 7 years in school, and then I was kind of lucky that while I was studying, our university program was a little bit unique in that we were kind of alternating semesters. Basically, one semester you were in school, one semester you were working for some firm somewhere. So by the time my 7 years were done and I got out with my graduate degree, I had racked up about 2 or 3 years of professional experience, um, all over the U.S., a little bit in Europe as well. So what that kind of allowed me to do is basically see the architectural practice and how different it could be place to place. I mean, even just within different places in the U.S., it was wildly different. Let alone then when you kind of jump to Europe and kind of see how people are doing the business over there. But so I had that perspective, and I was very lucky that right after grad school, I joined. a fantastic firm here in Timberlake in Philadelphia. And I mean, fantastic not just for their design work, which is internationally recognized. And if anybody hasn't seen it before, I highly encourage you to check it out. But they also had a very talented research team, and they were even working on a couple of pieces of software. So I started as a traditional architect, but the thing is that very quickly working in that role, I started to get frustrated with the tools that were available to us as architects. And for me, it was frustrating because I spent 7 years working on a degree, and then my day-to-day work kind of seemed to really not take advantage of all the special knowledge and the skills that I had learned over those years. A lot of it was very manual, very tedious, and I really didn't think that it would ultimately make for a better project for me to spend my time the way I was spending it. So I started kind of, basically teaching myself how to write code and how to write, at first it was basic scripts, and that kind of evolved into basic plugins, and that kind of evolved into something else. And was very lucky then that our research team at Kieran Timberlake offered to take me in, and I could help them out, which exposed me to software development at a bit of a different scale. I got my hands on desktop applications, a little bit of web applications, some prototyping efforts around manufacturing and simulation. And it really kind of gave me the confidence that, number one, that I could do it because I didn't have that background, but it also gave me the confidence that it makes a difference, because the things that we built, we could deploy them to the rest of the designers working in the firm, and we could very directly get feedback and see how it was making a tangible difference to their work and to the buildings that we actually would start building. And that's essentially how I got into it. And since then, I've kind of been, more and more involved into the technology side. And Enscape was the first kind of proper tech company that I joined because I kind of wanted to take it to the next level and learn even more. But I'm very, very glad that I was able to have that experience right out of grad school, basically.
Yeah, and you're in that unique area of like you have so much of the industry knowledge going into the work that you're doing now as a product leader. Do you find like are there other people in this field that are in the similar boat? Have you come across them? I wonder if it's like a rare unicorn kind of thing.
No, it is. There are people in the field, but that's exactly what honestly we call them. They're unicorns. It's a fairly small community, and but I honestly have to thank that community for helping me get here. And going back to an earlier answer of why I value the internet so much as a great invention, but as I was starting to tinker with a lot of these things, I needed support. There was a lot of questions that I just couldn't answer myself, and over time, enough searching and enough Googling, I started to find, a network of people through tools like LinkedIn, Twitter. And I was very surprised to see that, oh, wow, there's other people out there that are kind of doing the same things. And, I made a very deliberate effort to connect with them digitally and through industry events and things like that, and just make connections and find collaborators that would, you know, waste a weekend with me doing like a hackathon project or tinkering with something that we had no idea if it would actually work, but we wanted to learn and find out. And that community was really critical for me to get here. And yeah, they're definitely out there.
Gotcha. How did you find this community or like how do you get involved in it? You mentioned you like found them through LinkedIn, but is there like an official community of like ex-architects, product leader kind of community out there?
um, I don't know if there's anything quote unquote official. I think at first the way I was introduced to it is just some colleagues and peers at the research group at Kieran Timberlake. And then I have to also extend a huge amount of gratitude to there's a company that puts on an annual event. The company's Thornton Tomasetti. They're an engineering company, but they do an annual event called AEC Tech in New York, and it's kind of a meetup. There's kind of two parts. There's a symposium where people give talks, and then there's a kind of a 2 day hackathon portion where people work on projects. And for me, attending that event was really the way for me to get in that community, because basically a lot of the quote unquote unicorns, at least on the North American side, and some Europeans and South Americans, of course, but they would I realized that they aggregate towards this event almost annually. And I was able to make a lot of connections there. And of course, once you make even just a few initial connections, those people are able to introduce you to other people or daylight projects, or introduce you to other events where you might be able to meet other people. And, it kind of, you know, expanded basically exponentially after that. And I continued to seek out those people. And, not too late after that, I found that people started to seek me out, which was a crazy experience, somebody reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, I want to learn from something you did." But um, for me, it was also really important to respond to those people, because that's how the network works. I mean, that's how other people turn into similar kinds of unicorns with the support from us, now that we have a little bit more experience. So it's been a great community to be a part of.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's always about giving back, right? And that's also part of the reason why we're doing this podcast is what are some of the knowledge, what are some of the things that we learned as a product leader to then share this back to the community. And I'm curious, like, what are some of the conversations that have been happening in this particular community? And is there something that we should be looking out for in the future?
Yeah, I think what's great about this community is they see very directly how their work can have an impact, right? Because if you can affect the design of a building in a positive way, whether it's positive for people or positive for the environment, it's very easy to see once that building is built, and you can experience it, right? You can go into that building, you can walk around it, and you can say, "Hey, here's the thing that I did or that somebody else did that really made a difference." And I think it's especially important today because our generation and those after us have a huge task at hand, especially with the climate situation and the increasing focus of importance that we have on it. It's a very important thing, and buildings account for I don't want to be quoted on the number, but something like 40% of global energy consumption. It might even be more at this point, but so
Oh,
for us as a
wow.
community, exactly. For us as a community, we see that as a very direct and actionable thing that we can affect, because the traditional design process is a little bit disconnected from the process of analysis of actually quantifying the impact that your design decisions have, right? So I think more and more what I've seen is that the community is focusing on things like embodied carbon, on things like electrical loads, heating and cooling. How do we create passive design strategies to reduce the reliance on AC or heating, et cetera? How do we essentially reduce our footprint? Which for me is fantastic. I mean, that's so inspiring to see people caring about a topic so important, and to
Mm.
putting their time into solving a problem, which, I mean, you can't solve alone. This is a very collaborative industry. You need engineers, you need contractors, you need designers. And I think that trend is going to continue, and I'm very glad that it's going to continue because it's a very important problem that we have to solve as a society.
Wow, yeah, I mean, that's something that I don't think we think about very often. It's like, how does what we build impact like where we're going to be in the future in terms of environment and how that impacts our daily environment. What are some of the things that's creating impact with the work that you're doing at Enscape?
Yeah, great question. I think it really starts with one of our key product philosophies, which is that Enscape should be a tool for anyone and everyone working in the design space. And it's kind of it might sound so simple to people working in a B2C product company, but traditionally for architecture and design, um, specializing in something, whether it's analysis or whether it's visualization, has really been well reserved for specialists. And your kind of everyday designer has been unable to access that, unfortunately. So we've always tried to make sure that the product that we create requires minimal training. It doesn't require, to spend a ton of hours learning how to use the thing. It just has to work, and it has to give you feedback as quickly as possible. And the impact of that is that, with the push of a button, anybody that's making a design decision for a building can see that impact in real time. The example I always like to use is making a window bigger or smaller, right? Or adding lights in a room. At the push of a button, you can very articulately and clearly see what that impact is going to have. And you can imagine, you can put yourself in that room and say, well, okay, if I was living in this house or if I was working in this office, what would that mean for me? Is this enough light? Would it kind of create a dangerous amount of glare? Or there's a number of other questions that come up, but it's much easier for you to think of
Mm.
those questions when you kind of see it in front of you. Otherwise, when you're just kind of looking at a piece of paper or a two-dimensional drawing, it's much harder to imagine the implications that a simple decision like making a window bigger or smaller could have. And what we like to think is that when you kind of put those questions in front of people, you enable them to make better decisions, which then of course would of course have an impact on the occupants of that building, whether it's an office or a house, and it should positively impact the outcome of that space.
Yeah, and it sounds like such an obvious solution too, right? Like, would you rather just get a piece of paper that tells you about the impact or actually visually be able to see the impact that that this design is going to have? And I'm curious, like, was there like before this technology existed, like how long did those decisions typically take? Because now you're saying like with a click of a
Mm.
button, you can enlarge the window and see what the impact is there, but before that, it was just it's done via paper, I assume, or I don't know. I don't know anything about this industry, so you tell me.
Yeah, well, at the very early days, of course, yes, it was done by a professional artist, right? And you had to rely on the professional artist to kind of have the understanding of physical reality to create a rendering for you that represents it. But over time, of course, we had computer graphics technology come up, but although accurate, not so easy to access. So before real-time technology, what most designers were doing is that when they kind of had a 3D model at a place where they thought was good enough, they basically send it to a team of professional 3D artists. They would, set up the scene, work with the geometry, apply materials, and then they would hit the render button. But of course, that rendering might take, not milliseconds as is our case, but it might take hours, days in some cases,
Oh
right?
wow.
Because that was just kind of the limit of the technology of the time. CPUs were simply not the best for delivering quick results, accurate results, but not quick results. Um, and so basically what that would mean is that that architect would get an image back, a week, maybe 2 weeks, right? Because the 3D studio has, of course, other projects that they need to do in parallel. And guess what? By the time you get that image in your hands, well, a lot of times it's too late to change the design. You've already sent it to a client, or a firm leader has already made a decision. So really, what's the point of this image at that point? You cannot affect anything. You might know that you were wrong or right, but yeah, in a lot of cases, it might be too late. I think the great thing about our technology and our product is that it reduces the amount of times where you're missing a window to make an actual impact.
Wow, so you're saving so much time and that equates to money for this industry just by being able to have those renderings within in real time. I can't imagine like how many design mistakes were made or how many designs were just kind of like shipped off because it took forever to re-render those 3D images during this phase.
Oh yeah.
So we're coming up on time. Peter, I'm curious if there's any other last minute advice you would give to our product audience in regards to remote work or transitioning from architect to product leader or mergers and acquisitions, since those are the three topics that we discussed.
Yeah, I'd say just as a really general kind of advice to anybody and everybody listening, I'd say is that we work with technology and we work with products at the end of the day, but I think primarily we work with people. And one thing we always like to reiterate at Enscape, and now at Chaos, that we're part of a bigger group, is that we put people first. And in my experience, that's almost not almost that's always a winning strategy, because if you create the right type of environment where everybody feels professionally and personally happy, the technology and the products are almost going to build themselves, because if you have the right team to start out with, yeah, putting them in that kind of environment is always going to position you for success. So it's not easy, right? And it does create some long days when you have to kind of employ that strategy of individualism that I was talking about earlier on a couple previous points. But it's really really worth it, and it makes a huge difference, I think. And sometimes it's easy to forget, especially working at a certain scale, and looking at a large team or even merging large teams or large products. But it's very important to kind of keep a focus on that, I think, no matter what scale you're working on. And I, the results will come if you focus on the people and make sure that they're in a happy place to do their best work.
I love that advice. Take care of your people and they'll take care of your product and your customers, essentially.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Peter. If anyone wants to get in contact with you, what's the best way to reach you?
Great question. So, as I mentioned before, one of my favorite platforms is Twitter. People can reach me there. My handle is MITEVPI, and that's actually my username on just about any platform. So, just feel free to Google that or Google my name. That's probably the best way to reach me. And I tend to be very responsive. As we talked about earlier, I think for me, it's super important to give back to a community that gave me so much and continues to give me so much day after day. So definitely don't be a stranger. Feel free to ask any questions, or maybe you have a cool project that you wanna get some advice or help on. And yeah, I'm here.
Amazing. Thank you so much. All right, guys. Thanks for listening, and I will see you all next week.